Most American fighter pilots in 1944 were not dying in combat. They were dying because they believed the wrong thing. They believed that survival required fighting. They believed that turning toward the enemy was courage. They believed that speed without violence was useless. Every mission, those beliefs were reinforced. Training manuals, briefings, tradition. No one questioned them because questioning them felt dangerous. But hidden inside the aircraft they were flying was a fact almost no one was using. A simple advantage that changed the math of the air war. Not firepower, not maneuverability, speed. One pilot noticed it. Not a commander, not an ace, not a strategist. Just someone who trusted numbers more than instinct. He did something that looked like failure. He refused to fight. He didn't turn. He didn't chase. He ran. What followed wasn't a victory anyone celebrated. No kills, no medals, no headlines. But it exposed a secret that quietly altered how the war in the sky was fought. This is not a story about bravery in battle. It's about how a single false belief kept killing pilots, and how breaking that belief changed the outcome of the air war without most people ever noticing. If you stay until the end, you'll understand why one of the most important shifts in World War II happened without orders, without announcements, and without anyone realizing it at the time. If you stay with this story, you'll discover how a single, untested belief quietly killed pilots, and how breaking it changed the air war without most people ever noticing. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had settled into something dangerously familiar. Every morning, American bombers formed up over England and pointed east. Every clear day, they flew the same routes, at the same altitudes, into the same skies. And every day, American fighter pilots escorted them with absolute confidence in one idea. When the enemy appears, you turn toward him. You fight. This belief wasn't debated. It wasn't argued. It was treated as fact. Fighter pilots were trained to engage because engagement felt like control. Turning into the enemy meant you were doing something. It meant you were aggressive. It meant you were brave. Running, on the other hand, felt like failure. From the moment pilots entered training, they were taught that survival depended on confrontation. Dogfighting was not just a tactic, it was an identity. To be a fighter pilot meant closing distance, accepting risk, and forcing a decision. And on paper, it made sense. Escort fighters existed to protect bombers. If enemy fighters appeared, they had to be destroyed before reaching the formations. That logic was simple, clean, and deeply reassuring. But it rested on an assumption that no one stopped to examine, that the best way to protect something was always to fight for it. In reality, the skies over Germany were revealing a different truth. Each time American fighters broke formation to engage, they paid a price. They lost altitude. They lost speed. They burned fuel at a rate that no briefing fully captured. German pilots understood this perfectly. They didn't always need to win the dogfight. They only needed to pull escorts down, separate them, and create gaps. Once the escorts were scattered, bombers became vulnerable again. The result was chaos spread across miles of sky. American pilots returned with stories of fierce engagements and narrow escapes. Others didn't return at all, not because they were outmatched in skill, but because they ran out of options. Fuel gauges crept toward empty. Engines coughed over hostile territory. Pilots bailed out not after losing a fight, but after staying in one too long. Yet none of this triggered a fundamental rethink. Losses were attributed to bad luck, to weather, to numbers, to the inevitable cost of war. The doctrine itself remained untouched. The rule persisted because it felt moral. Turning toward danger felt honorable. Turning away felt wrong. No one wanted to be the pilot who didn't fight. What made this even more dangerous was that technology had quietly moved on. The aircraft escorting the bombers in 1944 were not the same machines pilots had trained on years earlier. They were faster, more efficient, designed for a different kind of war. But the thinking had not caught up. Pilots were flying modern aircraft with old instincts. They were trained to believe that speed mattered only inside a fight to gain an advantage, to reposition, to escape briefly before re-engaging. Speed was seen as a tool within combat, not an alternative to it. No one seriously considered that speed itself could be the solution. That assumption went unchallenged because it felt uncomfortable. If speed alone could save you, then fighting wasn't always necessary. And if fighting wasn't always necessary, then many previous losses took on a disturbing new meaning. It implied that pilots had died not because the enemy was stronger, but because the rules they followed were incomplete. That idea was difficult to accept. Institutions resist questions that threaten their moral foundations. So the doctrine survived, reinforced by tradition and repetition. Briefings repeated it. Instructors enforced it. Veterans passed it down. The sky became a place where courage was measured by willingness to engage, not by the wisdom of avoidance. And so American fighters kept turning toward danger, even when their aircraft gave them another option. The tragedy wasn't that no one knew the aircraft was fast. The tragedy was that no one had connected that fact to survival. Not yet. Spring of 1944, the air war had reached a breaking point. The missions kept coming. The targets went deeper, and the margin for error grew thinner. With every flight east, American bombers were now striking the industrial heart of Germany. The distances were longer. The airspace was denser. The resistance was more organized. What had once been occasional strain was becoming constant pressure. Escort fighters were expected to do everything at once. They had to stay close enough to protect the bombers. They had to be aggressive enough to deter interceptors. They had to conserve fuel while fighting extended engagements at high altitude. On briefing room maps, it all worked. In the air, it rarely did. Every engagement pulled the system apart. When fighters dove to meet the enemy, they surrendered altitude, a resource that could not be regained without time and fuel. When they turned hard, they bled speed energy that defined whether you lived or died minutes later. And when they chased, they separated, turning coordinated defense into isolated survival. None of these failures looked dramatic in isolation. They didn't explode. They didn't announce themselves. They accumulated quietly. A few extra minutes at full power. A few thousand feet lost. A few miles out of position. By the time the consequences appeared, the original decision was already forgotten. German pilots understood this environment intimately. They did not need to destroy American fighters to succeed. They only needed to manipulate them. By threatening the bomber stream, they forced escorts to react. By disengaging at the right moment, they dragged fighters downward. By splitting formations, they reopened access to the bombers. The escorts were doing exactly what they were trained to do. And that was the problem. The system rewarded immediate action, not long-term positioning. It praised engagement, not restraint. Pilots who turned toward the enemy were seen as doing their job. Pilots who stayed high, stayed fast, and avoided the fight were harder to evaluate. So the system quietly pushed everyone toward the same behavior. Losses mounted not in spectacular disasters, but in steady attrition. A pilot forced to land in neutral territory, another bailing out over occupied land, another gliding toward the sea with an empty tank. Each loss was recorded, categorized, and absorbed. No single incident was alarming enough to trigger reform, but together, they formed a pattern. The escort force was being worn down by its own doctrine. Commanders knew something was wrong. Reports mentioned fuel exhaustion. They mentioned scattered escorts. They mentioned pilots forced into unfavorable fights, far from the bombers they were meant to protect. But these were treated as operational challenges, not conceptual ones. The assumption remained intact. Fighting was unavoidable. Technology, meanwhile, was quietly widening the gap between what was possible and what was practiced. Escort fighters now had the range to accompany bombers to their targets and back. They had engines optimized for sustained high-speed flight at altitude. They were no longer tied to the short-range, defensive mindset of earlier years. But pilots were still thinking in terms of turning fights and tactical engagements. They used speed to enter combat, not to avoid it. They treated it as a momentary advantage rather than a strategic one. This mismatch created tension inside the cockpit. Pilots could feel the aircraft's capability. They knew how fast it could go. They felt the smooth acceleration in level flight. Yet everything they had been taught told them not to use it that way. To fly straight and run felt wrong. It felt passive. It felt irresponsible. The system reinforced that feeling. There were no manuals describing escape as a tactic. No briefings encouraging pilots to preserve energy by refusing engagement. No metrics celebrating missions where no shots were fired. Success was measured in encounters, not in survivals. And so pilots continued to fight even when fighting offered no advantage. They entered engagements that cost them fuel they could not spare. They chased enemies who dictated the terms. They accepted risk because the alternative had no name. This was the quiet danger of doctrine. That it was wrong in every case, but that it was applied everywhere, without exception. By early 1944, the air war had reached a moment where small decisions carried irreversible consequences. One wrong turn, one unnecessary dive, one prolonged fight. The system demanded obedience, not experimentation. And yet, inside that pressure, something was beginning to shift. Not in headquarters, not in official doctrine, but in individual cockpits, where pilots had time to think and time to notice what the aircraft could actually do. One of them was about to test an idea that the system had never sanctioned. Not because he wanted to challenge authority, but because the numbers no longer made sense. The problem was no longer just doctrine. It was interpretation. By 1944, American fighter pilots were flying aircraft that no longer fit the mental models they had been trained with. The machines had changed faster than the thinking behind them. Escort fighters were no longer short-range defenders. They were no longer tied to a narrow bubble of protection. They were no longer built only to turn tightly and fight up close. But pilots were still treating them that way. Inside every cockpit was a contradiction. Pilots could feel it every time they leveled off at altitude and advanced the throttle. The aircraft responded smoothly, relentlessly, eating distance without drama. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't cinematic. It was efficient. And efficiency had no place in the mythology of air combat. Speed, in the fighter pilot's mind, belonged to moments that dive into combat, the escape from a losing turn, the brief sprint before re-engaging. It was a tactical advantage, not a strategic one. The idea that speed could replace fighting felt backwards. If you had speed, the instinct was to use it to attack, to close, to commit. Running felt like wasting the airplane's potential. This was the trap. The aircraft was designed around a different assumption than the one pilots were using. Its strength was not in winning turning contests. It was in maintaining energy, staying fast, staying high, staying difficult to touch. In straight, level flight at altitude, the aircraft occupied a narrow band of performance few opponents could match. Not briefly, sustainably. That difference mattered, but it only mattered if someone was willing to treat speed not as a means to combat, but as a substitute for it. The manuals contained the numbers, top speeds, power settings, fuel consumption curves. Nothing was hidden. What was missing was the mental leap. Doctrine had framed combat as binary. You were either engaging the enemy or abandoning the mission. There was no category for disengagement as success. So pilots interpreted the aircraft's performance through an outdated lens. They flew faster machines but fought slower wars. Most of the time, this mismatch went unnoticed. The aircraft was forgiving enough to survive misuse. Pilots adapted instinctively, compensating with skill and courage. But as missions grew longer and deeper, those margins disappeared. Speed without intention became wasted potential. Some pilots began to sense this, even if they couldn't articulate it. They noticed how the aircraft felt when left alone in clean air, how stable it was at high speed, how little effort it took to stay ahead rather than inside the fight. They noticed how quickly energy vanished once a turn was committed, how altitude surrendered itself in seconds, how recovery took minutes that no one had. These observations were not shared openly. They didn't fit into briefings. They didn't translate into doctrine. They were personal, intuitive, and slightly uncomfortable. Talking about them sounded like admitting doubt, and doubt had no place in a system built on confidence. What separated one pilot from the rest was not courage or experience. It was curiosity, the willingness to ask a question that training never encouraged. Not, how do I win this fight? Was, but do I need to be in this fight at all? Where? That question changed everything. Because once it was asked, the aircraft no longer looked like a weapon alone. It looked like an answer, a way out, a way to avoid the cascade of losses that followed every unnecessary engagement. But the question carried risk. If the answer was wrong, the consequences were immediate and final. You would be alone, exposed, and far from help. There was no safety net for experimentation, no test flights, no simulations, no doctrine to fall back on. The system did not protect people who tried new ideas. It punished them. That was why no one had tried it deliberately. Not because the idea was impossible, but because it required stepping outside the logic that defined a fighter pilot's identity. It required trusting the aircraft more than tradition, numbers more than instinct, outcomes more than appearances. In a culture that celebrated aggression, choosing speed over combat looked like hesitation. But in the air war of 1944, hesitation was not the opposite of courage. It was the beginning of analysis. The pilot was about to test that analysis under conditions where there would be no second chance. Not to make a point, not to change doctrine, simply to see whether the airplane could do what the manuals quietly promised. The system had never approved the experiment. The sky was about to run it anyway. The moment did not arrive with drama. There was no warning, no clear signal that something historic was about to happen. It arrived the way most irreversible decisions do, quietly, in the space of a few seconds, inside a cockpit already full of noise. The mission that day was routine. The route was familiar. The formation held steady. Everything about it suggested that the rules would apply the way they always had. Then the enemy appeared, high, climbing, positioned exactly where doctrine said they would be. The call came as expected. Break formation. Turn toward the threat. Pilots reacted automatically. Training took over. Aircraft rolled and dove, trading altitude for initiative. For a moment, nothing looked unusual. And then one pilot hesitated, not because he was confused, not because he was afraid, because he saw something that didn't fit. The enemy's climb angle, their spacing, the way they weren't committing. This was not an attack. It was a provocation. If the escorts dove, they would follow. If the escorts turned, they would disengage. If the escorts burned fuel, they would wait. The system was about to repeat itself. That was when the decision happened. It wasn't announced. It wasn't coordinated. No one approved it. The pilot leveled his wings. Instead of diving, he stabilized. Instead of turning, he held course. Then he advanced the throttle all the way forward. This was the moment doctrine said not to create. Straight flight meant exposure. Level flight meant vulnerability. Running meant surrendering the initiative. Everything he had been taught argued against it. But the numbers argued louder. The aircraft responded immediately. Acceleration came smoothly, without violence. The airspeed climbed. At first, nothing else changed. The enemy reacted the way they always had. They turned to pursue. That was the confirmation. If the aircraft could not do what the manuals promised, the mistake would become obvious within seconds. There would be no room to recover. The distance began to stretch. Not dramatically, not instantly, just enough to notice. The pilot kept the aircraft level, resisting every instinct to maneuver. No evasive turns, no dives. He did not fight the aircraft. He let it work. The enemy closed at first, fueled by altitude and expectation. But then, the gap stopped shrinking. Then it held. Then it began to widen. This was the moment where instinct screamed for confirmation. Turn and finish it. Climb and reposition. Do something. He did nothing. The aircraft continued forward, stable and relentless. Engine temperatures climbed. Limits approached. This was not a sustainable state. It was a calculated risk. He did not need minutes. He needed seconds. Behind him, the enemy formation stretched. The faster aircraft pulled ahead. The slower ones fell back. The cohesion that made them dangerous began to fracture. They fired when they could. Most of it fell short. They were flying at the edge of their envelope. The aircraft ahead of them was flying inside its design. That difference was decisive. One by one, the pursuers broke off. Not because they were defeated, but because they were wasting fuel they could not afford to lose. The pilot did not watch them leave. He stayed focused forward, monitoring gauges, waiting for the moment he could pull back without destroying the engine. When he finally reduced power, the aircraft shuddered slightly, then settled. He was alone again, alive. Nothing about the outcome felt triumphant. There was no satisfaction, only confirmation. The aircraft had done exactly what the numbers said it would do. The fight had been avoided, not escaped. not survived, but made irrelevant. This was the dangerous part, because once the decision worked once, it became repeatable. And once it was repeatable, the doctrine that insisted on constant engagement lost its authority. The pilot returned without fanfare. There was no debrief built for what he had done. No checkbox for refusal to engage. He described the facts, the pursuit, the distance opening, the disengagement. There was no argument against it, only discomfort, because what he had demonstrated was not bravery or luck. It was an alternative, and alternatives threaten systems more than failures do. The system could explain away losses, not easily explain away survival that came from disobedience. No orders were changed that day. No manuals rewritten, but something had shifted, not officially, quietly. The decision that should not have worked had worked, and now it existed. A proof, carried from cockpit to cockpit, that the rules were not laws, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in war was not the enemy, but the assumptions you brought with you into the fight. Outside, it looked like nothing had changed. The same formations flew, the same interceptors climbed, the same radios crackled with urgency. But inside the system, something had begun to fail. The enemy pilots did not misunderstand what had happened. They understood it perfectly. They saw an aircraft refuse to turn. They saw it hold level flight. They saw the distance open instead of close. This was not confusing. What confused them was what it meant. Their training had prepared them for fights, not absences. For engagement, not denial. They were taught that speed existed to create advantage inside combat, to reposition, to attack from a better angle. They were not taught that speed could remove combat from the equation entirely. So when the American aircraft accelerated and did not return, the enemy reacted the only way their system allowed. They pursued. Pursuit made sense inside their framework. If an enemy ran, it meant he was vulnerable. If he was vulnerable, he could be destroyed. That assumption had worked for years, but it depended on a condition that was no longer true, that the pursuer could eventually close the distance. Once that condition failed, the logic collapsed. The pursuit stretched formations thin. Faster aircraft pulled ahead. Slower ones lagged behind. The cohesion that gave the interceptors their lethality dissolved under sustained acceleration. This was not a tactical error. It was a structural one. The enemy's aircraft had been designed for a different problem set. Climb rate, roll rate, short, violent engagements near defended territory. They excelled at forcing combat. They were not built to sustain long, level chases at high altitude. The enemy pilots knew this, but knowing it did not help. Their doctrine gave them no alternative response. They could not disengage early without appearing ineffective. They could not hold position without abandoning the pursuit. They could not switch roles mid-flight. The system demanded action, and action meant chase. This was the trap of doctrine. When conditions change, doctrine does not adapt automatically. It continues to produce the same responses even when those responses no longer work. The enemy pilots did not lack intelligence. They lacked permission. Permission to not pursue. Permission to disengage without shame. Permission to accept that some enemies could no longer be forced into combat. Their radios reflected this confusion. Reports described aircraft that could not be caught, formations that stretched and failed, fuel states that dropped faster than expected. These were not complaints, they were observations. But observations alone do not change systems. For a system to adapt, it must admit that its assumptions are outdated, and that admission is costly. It threatens training pipelines. It undermines authority. It forces reevaluation of everything built on top of it. So the enemy system responded the way rigid systems often do. It absorbed the anomaly and moved on. The incidents were treated as exceptions, as lucky escapes. As pilots exaggerating performance, there was no immediate rewrite of expectations. The enemy continued to plan interceptions based on engagement, continued to assume that contact would lead to combat, continued to expect the escort fighters to turn. But now, sometimes, they didn't. And that unpredictability was corrosive. The enemy could no longer rely on reaction alone. They could no longer force every encounter into the same shape. This did not mean they were suddenly losing every engagement. It meant that control was slipping. Air combat is not decided only by kills. It is decided by who dictates the terms of interaction. By refusing to engage, the American aircraft removed that control. The enemy could still fight, but only when the Americans allowed it. This asymmetry was new, and it was deeply uncomfortable. The enemy pilots began burning fuel for nothing. They climbed to meet threats that vanished. They chased contacts that never resolved into engagements. Every minute spent doing this was a minute not spent intercepting bombers. The system was being distracted, not by deception, not by feints, by absence. The enemy had no immediate counter because counters require categories, and this behavior did not fit any existing category. It wasn't attack. It wasn't retreat. It wasn't evasion. It was denial. Denial of combat. Denial of engagement. Denial of the enemy's preferred fight. This is the most difficult thing for a military system to respond to, because it attacks not capability, but relevance. The enemy could still fight well. They could still climb. They could still maneuver. But those strengths mattered less if the fight never happened. This did not collapse the enemy overnight. It weakened them quietly. It increased uncertainty. It eroded confidence. It forced pilots to question whether the assumptions they relied on would hold. Meanwhile, the American system was changing slowly, unofficially. Pilots began to recognize that refusing combat was not cowardice. That survival could be a form of success. That speed could be a boundary, not just a weapon. The enemy did not fail because they were inferior. They failed because they adapted slower than reality. And in war, that delay is often enough. Orders were issued. No doctrine was rewritten. No briefing slide appeared explaining a new way to survive. Officially, nothing had changed. And yet, something was spreading. It didn't move through command channels. It moved through conversations, quiet ones, short ones. Usually after missions, when engines cooled and adrenaline faded, pilots compared notes, not about victories, not about kills, about distance, fuel, who came home and why. Someone would mention a moment when they didn't turn, when they stayed high, when they pushed forward instead of committing. Another would nod, say they'd tried something similar, say it worked. These were not formal lessons. They were survival tips. They carried more weight than doctrine because they were paid for in risk. What made the shift possible was that it didn't demand belief, only repetition. Pilots didn't need to accept a new theory. They only needed to notice that certain choices led to fewer emergencies. They noticed that refusing a bad fight preserved altitude. That preserving altitude preserved options. That options meant time, and time meant life. The idea didn't spread as a rule. It spread as permission. Permission to think. Permission to choose not to engage. Permission to treat survival as success. This was a radical change not in tactics, but in values. For years, pilots had been taught that bravery meant closing distance. Now, quietly, bravery began to mean restraint. Not always, not universally, but enough. What made the shift invisible was that it did not look like innovation. From the ground, missions looked the same. From reports, sorties continued. From statistics, nothing dramatic appeared at first. The numbers changed slowly. Loss rates dipped, then stabilized. Fuel emergencies declined. Fewer pilots were forced to land away from home. No single data point could be traced to a specific tactic, but patterns began to emerge. Pilots were returning with more fuel. Formations were staying intact longer. Fewer escorts were being dragged into low-altitude chaos. The system was benefiting from a behavior it had never officially endorsed. This is how real change often happens in large organizations, not through directives, but through imitation. When one pilot survived by refusing a fight, others noticed. When several did, the behavior gained legitimacy. It became acceptable not because it was ordered, but because it worked. Importantly, this did not eliminate combat. Pilots still fought when necessary. They still engaged when the situation demanded it. But now engagement was a choice, not a reflex. That distinction mattered. It shifted control back to the pilot. Instead of reacting to the enemy's presence, pilots began reacting to the enemy's position. Instead of assuming every contact required confrontation, they began evaluating whether the fight made sense. This was not cowardice. It was selectivity. And selectivity changed the geometry of the air war. Enemy interceptors could no longer rely on predictable responses. They could no longer force escorts into energy-draining maneuvers simply by appearing. Sometimes the Americans turned. Sometimes they didn't. That uncertainty was destabilizing. Meanwhile, the American system gained something it had been losing: consistency. Bombers arrived with escorts still in place. Fighters arrived home with margins instead of emergencies. The air war became less about dramatic engagements and more about sustained pressure. This suited the strategic reality of 1944. The goal was not to win individual dogfights. It was to grind down the enemy's capacity to resist. That required presence, not heroics. By refusing unnecessary combat, pilots were doing exactly that, even if no one framed it that way. What makes this phase easy to miss in history is that it left no signature moment. There was no announcement that tactics had changed, no famous order that historians could point to. The change existed between lines of reports, in the absence of losses, in the quiet normalcy of missions that ended without incident. Those do not make headlines, but they decide wars. The system did not need to understand why the change worked. It only needed to benefit from it, and it did. As spring turned into summer, the air campaign intensified. Targets multiplied. Operations accelerated. Escort losses did not rise proportionally. Something had absorbed the pressure. Not a new weapon, not a new aircraft, a new choice. The system had evolved without knowing it was evolving. That is, the dangerous power of unofficial adaptation. It cannot be stopped easily. It cannot be undone by orders. Once pilots internalize a better way to survive, they do not forget it. What began as a personal decision had become an unspoken option available to everyone. Not always used, not always appropriate, but always there. The doctrine still existed on paper, but in the air, reality had added a footnote. Engage when it makes sense. If not, stay fast, stay high, stay alive. The war in the sky had not been won yet, but it was no longer being fought on the enemy's terms. Wars are often measured by what is destroyed, cities leveled, aircraft shot down, men lost. But sometimes the most important changes are measured by what stops happening. In the months after the shift began, unannounced and unofficial, something subtle took place in the air war over Europe. Pilots started coming home more often. Not dramatically more often. Not enough to trigger headlines. Just enough to notice. Fewer emergency landings. Fewer forced bailouts. Fewer aircraft limping back on fumes. The difference did not feel like victory. It felt like relief. And relief is rarely celebrated. What changed was not courage. Pilots were not suddenly more cautious or less willing to fight. What changed was exposure. By refusing unnecessary engagements, pilots reduced the number of moments where a single mistake could cascade into disaster. They stayed higher longer. They stayed faster longer. They stayed together longer. Those three things mattered more than any single maneuver. Altitude gave them time. Speed gave them options. Formation gave them support. When one was lost, the others compensated. But when all three were surrendered at once, as often happened in turning fights, the margin vanished. That margin was now being preserved. The effect showed itself in small ways. Pilots returned less exhausted. Engines returned less abused. Maintenance crews noticed fewer airframes damaged by stress rather than enemy fire. The war became slightly less desperate, mission by mission. This mattered because desperation kills quietly. It pushes pilots to accept bad fights. It narrows judgment. It accelerates mistakes. By lowering the baseline stress of escort missions, the system regained balance. Pilots had more mental space to think. And thinking is the most undervalued resource in combat. When every mission feels like a gamble, instinct dominates. When survival feels possible, analysis returns. This shift also changed how pilots evaluated risk. Before, danger was binary. You either fought or you failed. Now, danger had gradations. Some fights were worth taking, others were not. Pilots began distinguishing between necessary risk and inherited risk. Necessary risk was unavoidable, protecting bombers under direct threat. Inherited risk came from habit engaging because that was what had always been done. The second category began to shrink. As it did, something else became visible. The enemy's pressure felt less overwhelming. Not because the enemy was weaker, but because fewer American pilots were exhausting themselves, chasing every provocation. Enemy interceptors could still appear. They could still threaten, but they no longer dictated the rhythm of the escort mission. That alone reduced losses. Control in combat is not only about firepower, it is about deciding when events escalate. By declining escalation, pilots were conserving themselves. This had a compounding effect. Pilots who survived missions gained experience. Experienced pilots made better decisions. Better decisions led to more survival. The system began feeding on itself in a positive way. This is how attrition reverses, not through a single breakthrough, but through accumulated restraint. The change also altered the emotional tone of missions. Pilots still feared combat. Fear did not disappear. But fear became less constant. It was no longer attached to every contact. There were moments of calm, moments where the aircraft was simply moving through the sky as designed. Those moments mattered. They reminded pilots that not every mission had to be a trial by fire. That knowledge preserved morale. Morale, like survival, is difficult to quantify but easy to lose. The quiet reduction in losses kept experienced crews in place. It kept leaders alive long enough to mentor others. It kept squadrons intact. These effects rarely appear in after-action reports. They appear in what does not need to be replaced, what did not need to be rebuilt, what did not need to be retrained. The enemy felt this indirectly. American escort coverage became more consistent. Bombers faced fewer windows of vulnerability. Even when engagements occurred, they happened on more favorable terms. The enemy was still fighting hard, still skilled, but they were no longer pulling escorts apart as easily. That alone saved lives without a single order being written. What makes this phase uncomfortable for traditional histories is that it resists hero narratives. There is no dramatic moment where everything turns. No single pilot to credit for the improved survival rate. Instead, there is a diffuse shift in behavior, a collective decision to avoid dying unnecessarily. History struggles with that. It prefers decisive actions and named commanders. But wars are often decided by accumulation, by thousands of small decisions made under pressure. This was one of them. The cost that disappeared did not disappear all at once. It thinned, gradually, quietly, until one day it became noticeable that fewer chairs were empty at briefings, that fewer families received telegrams, that fewer pilots were being replaced mid-campaign. Those absences mattered more than any statistic. They meant that the system was no longer eating itself, that it had learned informally, imperfectly, how to preserve its people. And in a war that demanded endurance above all else, that mattered more than glory. The war was not over, but it was now being fought by people who were still alive to fight it. The war did not end because of this idea. Bombs still fell, cities still burned, pilots still died. But the war changed in a way that history rarely notices. Not because someone issued a brilliant order, not because a new doctrine was announced, but because a quiet truth slipped into practice, that fighting is not the same thing as winning, and survival is not the opposite of courage. The belief that had killed so many pilots did not collapse publicly. It faded. It lost authority one decision at a time. No parade marked its passing. No medal recognized the moment it stopped being obeyed. But its absence was felt in every mission that ended without incident. The pilot who first proved the idea did not become famous. He did not reshape training manuals. He did not command squadrons. He simply demonstrated that the rules were not laws, that an assumption, repeated often enough, could feel like truth, until reality refused to cooperate. His legacy was not victory. It was permission. Permission for pilots to think instead of react. Permission to choose when not to fight. Permission to treat the aircraft not as a symbol of aggression, but as a system with limits and advantages. This kind of change rarely survives in official memory. Institutions prefer stories of decisive action, of heroes who attack, not those who decline. But modern warfare is not decided only by courage. It is decided by understanding, by recognizing when the conditions that made old rules effective no longer exist, by knowing when to stop applying solutions to problems that have already changed. That is the uncomfortable lesson buried in this story. The pilots who survived did not do so because they were braver than others. They survived because they questioned something that felt unquestionable. They noticed a mismatch between what they were told and what the aircraft could actually do. And when the moment came, they trusted reality over tradition. This lesson did not stay in the sky. It appears again and again across history. Armies that cling to outdated assumptions, organizations that confuse activity with effectiveness, people who mistake habit for wisdom. The danger is never the enemy alone. It is the belief that the way things have always been done must still be right. That belief is comforting. It removes responsibility. It turns decisions into reflexes. And reflexes are easy to exploit. What changed the air war was not a new weapon. It was the realization that not every threat must be answered on its own terms, that refusing the wrong fight can be the most decisive act available. The pilots who learned this did not think of themselves as innovators. They were not trying to change history. They were trying to come home. That is why this story matters. Because it reminds us that progress often arrives disguised as hesitation. That sometimes the smartest move looks like retreat until you understand the system you are operating inside. And that the most dangerous thing in any conflict is not fear or even defeat. It is obedience to an idea that no longer fits the world you are fighting in. That idea died quietly in the skies over Europe. No one noticed, but thousands lived because of it. It doesn't always change with explosions. Sometimes it changes when someone refuses to fight. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing.